Okay. Whenever you all are done with those thoughts, just feel free to kind of come around here and circle around this table. I want to give a little bit of a blow-by-blow of perspective drawing and thinking about where we're going. Okay. Good morning. How you doing, Jeremiah?
Doing all things else.
Good. Going over the process of perspective again, right? So these are the actual assignment sketchbook, the sketchbook assignment pages that I'm going to have you do. They don't have to be this big. If you wanted to try and conserve paper, you can go like a half a sheet. You might find that with 3-point perspective, having the bigger sheet, or with 2-point perspective, having the bigger sheet is beneficial. So this is like a quintessential example of drawing cubes in 1-point perspective. I'm saying cubes lightly. They're rectangular prisms, right? Some of them are cube-ish. But what we have here is a very clearly defined horizon line, and that is the key through which everything is going to build off of, right? Then from that horizon line, I'm going to establish a point. So the horizon line I just decided to put in the middle of the page. The point I kind of arbitrarily placed. I did keep it fairly centralized because if I'm thinking about things expanding out from it, that's how we have to kind of understand that type of perspective, right? Things expand out from that point as opposed to things receding towards multiple points. And then from here, I started with faces. So when I'm drawing these faces, true verticals, true horizontals. That's the easiest way to first conceptualize this, right? How am I then going to recede this into space? Any educated guesses?
Connect it to the point.
Connect what to what?
The corners.
The corners to
Vanishing.
the vanishing point, right? So I would like us to go through this process pretty stringently, where it's like, use a ruler, use the edge of a book, right? Use something flat that you can run a pen or a pencil along. Nico?
Yeah.
Nice to see you. And these points, every time I run into a corner, I will recede it back into the vanishing point, right? We can see that these two corners share the same recession line. And then if I was to draw this, I could draw this point if I wanted to, right? And I'm also cognizant of the fact that it's behind the object, right? It could be in front of the object, and actually, well, anyways, I'll show something like that in a little bit. Right, it's sitting behind that object. Now, there are ways that we can actually we can create measurements to create uniformity. So one, in terms of like actually measuring in perspective, in this case, what I'm going to say is I'm going to arbitrarily say that this box is that deep, right? So if this is a true vertical, what's going to happen there? True vertical. And that is how I construct that. Now this one here, I decided to send it off on a skew a little bit. So this is, I think, the big understanding with this, is that in 1-point perspective, I'm thinking about faces that are receding back into space. So in something like this, how am I distorting the orientation? Am I doing it this way? Am I doing it this way, right? So this is just purely a rotation of a face that's then going back into space. So if I was to then say that, let's say that this object goes back into space that much. How do I construct those lines? Would they be true verticals? They're going to be parallel to these lines here. So I can cite it out if I wanted to. In this case, I'm just going to kind of guesstimate it. And now I have an object that's twisted that's now going back into space. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. The fun thing about this is, let's say I started with a face that was like this, and then the back face is like this. I could, think of it like a sponge. I can twist it into space. So these lines coming back, let's just go through that experiment. Let's say I had something like this. I'm going to say that is where we're going. And I'm going to say this is where we end up. If I am aware that this shape is, let's say this side, the top of it is like this, and then the bottom of it is getting twisted that way. What I have to, I can in a literal sense connect the dots to these corners, right? Or in a manipulated sense, I can create distortions that occur. Right, so I'm kind of twisting that actually sort of forward in space. Does that all kind of make sense in theory? Okay, 1 point perspective. Any questions on how that gets constructed? So if you run into something, say in this building, that is a perfect quintessential 1 point perspective problem, we can identify a horizon line, find a vanishing point, and then everything's just going to build off of it. All right. 2 point perspective becomes less about, so actually in this case, we're more rooted in faces in terms of orientation, right? These aren't necessarily like tried and true universalities, but I do like thinking about this as a way of processing perspective initially, because then I at least have a reference point where if I start kind of manipulating what's going on, or if I start getting into more complicated perspectives, then I have an opportunity to really kind of just start with a basis point and then build off from there, right? In this case, we don't have a faces orientation. We have an edges orientation. So the way in which I started this was by constructing just simple edges. I gave myself a horizon line. I gave myself 2 vanishing points. I started drawing on this drawing upside down from when I started it. And now I'm just kind of building from here. So what ends up happening is any given edge, we start receding it back into space. Right? And this is now, I'm going to give some kind of like arbitrary rules to these forms. Anything that exists on, through, or through the horizon line, you're not going to see the top and the bottom of it, right? Think about having like a really tall cylinder, and you have to look up to see the top edge, and you have to look down to see the bottom edge, right? It's kind of like looking at a globe. looking at a spherical form. So those forms become pretty simple. Once we start getting things above or below the horizon line, and we can start to see either the tops or the bottoms of those forms, we now have to figure out where we're going to go, right? So I'm going to say this edge right here has a form that is, and I got ahead of myself here, true verticals for edges. So what are the sides going to be? True verticals. If I'm thinking about those as being pure prisms, right? If I started thinking about trapezoidal prisms, pyramids, all that kind of stuff, then those edges are going to change, but those forms would live inside, or they would expand beyond this initial box, that is either constructed off of like a faces or an edges orientation. So now I've got this arbitrary point here. How am I going to finish that form out?
The bottom.
I got to get the bottom in. So where do I start and where do I send it?
On the right to the left.
On the right to the left, on the left to the right. Yep. So this point here feels like it would make sense to go this way, but I've already gone that way. So for me to get the correct orientation for that, I have to go back the other way, right? And when it comes to like doing fast perspective drawing, you'll have stuff like this happen a lot, where as long as you're connecting your vanishing points and your corners, I'm going to require that you at least send some of them all the way back, right? But you might find that on some of them that it's like, I'm just going to try and get some basis for that so I can construct the form.
I thought you were just saying that they don't have tops or bottoms, or that just if they're on the horizon line.
Just on the horizon line, right? So if we think about it as, all right, your eye level is about right here. If I put this book to where your eye level is in the middle of it, can you see the actual bottom of the book? Can you see the actual top of the book? If I make it to where this is right in line with your eye line, you still won't see it, and this will now be flat, even if there is perspective changes in orientation, right? Once I get to where my actual horizon line, that floodplain of water filling up the room, is either going to submerge this book or the book is going to float over top of it, I will then start to see either the tops or the bottoms of that. Does that make sense? So in this one here, I have a lot of times what we'll do in the way that I've kind of designed this, right? I start with an edge, I send it back, I start finding the other sides, I start closing that out. What if I give you this like obscure basis of lines where I can give you this little Z2, 5, whichever way you're kind of looking at it, right? Can I actually finish that form out? Right, yeah. So I have points here that are established on these corners that as long as I am sending those back, right, and I've actually I've intentionally overdrawn this horizon line, or this recession line here. True verticals are close enough. I now have a 2-point perspective object there, right? Same thing with this here too. That would get sent back here, right? Same with this, where it's, if I rotate the orientation of the edge as opposed to the face, I'm still going to get the same sort of thing. So what I will just simply do here is draw out these recession points. Let's just say that it arbitrarily goes back that far. Let's just say that it arbitrarily goes back that far. And I can have a form that's rotated, but it's still, the edge of it is still in orientation with 2-point perspective. Right? So that's partially why when we were talking about yesterday, the idea that you could have something like a model stand that is receding into 1-point perspective, and then you could have something like a big block of horses, right? That just sits on that model stand in different orientation and goes back to 2-point perspective, right? The key with that is that they both will exist on the same horizon line, right? So I don't change my horizon line. If I was to change my horizon line and have sort of like a manipulation of the space in this regard, then you get something like I'll put an image on canvas. There's a really beautiful painting by a guy named Antonio Lopez Garcia that he did a painting of his bathroom sink. It's just this like kind of rubbish bathroom, and there's the sink, and there's tiles, and I think there might be a mirror, I can't remember, or a shelf. I think there's a shelf. But he definitely constructed this image with some sense of perspective. And if you really kind of calculate out the perspective, it is not totally, it's not totally flat. It's not totally flat. He's kind of doing something like this. And he's sort of looking down and it's kicking the sink up, and he's kind of looking up and it's kicking the shelf forward. And it doesn't make sense in a real sense, but it makes sense in a true sense. Does that make any sense? Right? Drawing and painting, things like that, I've always kind of liked referring to it as the lie through which the truth is revealed. Because to make something make sense on a 2D plane, we have to do things that are actually different than what exists in the world around us. Right? So this is the last one. This is 3-point perspective. All right. 3-point perspective makes your verticals actually have to recede somewhere. So as opposed to just constructing an arbitrary diagonal or an arbitrary vertical or a form that's oriented in space, all of the vertical lines either go up into a space. So think about kind of Mario treasure cubes or something floating in the air, or they go down like you're looking down from an airplane or looking down into a canyon or something like that, right? And that's how this whole form gets constructed. If I look at this edge, it goes up to that point. If I look at this edge, it goes up to that point. If I look at this edge, it goes up to that point. So all of my verticals will orient towards a vanishing point that is above or below. All of my horizontals will then vanish towards our standard 2-point perspective. And then we get a form that is receding away from us this way, as well as receding away from us that way. Yes?
So would this mostly be used, the 3-point perspective, if you're drawing something that's oriented like almost directly above you or like directly below you?
Yes. And so where this actually kind of grows is that there's a lot of perceptual painters that they don't really calculate this out. Lopez Garcia is actually a very good example of this. If you were to, this is kind of an interesting experiment. If you were to take just a finger, a pencil, something like that, and I start kind of looking towards one part of the room, and what I'm actually doing is I'm not actually paying attention to, say, like the exit sign behind Nico there. What I'm actually doing is I am looking out my periphery at the edge of that big whiteboard where the skeleton is intersecting with the corner there. And I'm just gonna start to kind of like, I'm gonna keep kind of turning a little bit until I can get enough orientation, and I start getting this little pull that happens. It's just because the way the light is going into your eye, it's starting to hit the edge of your eye, and things curve. In a rigid way, they curve this way, and then if I was to do a 4-point perspective drawing, what would happen is things would recede towards this point up here, but these verticals would then begin to recede towards those respective points. So 4-point perspective starts to do that, and the way we kind of maximize that is if we start curving those perspective lines in the way that you have latitude and longitude on the globe, you start getting form that way. And that kind of perspective drawing starts creating a little encapsulated world, almost like if you were looking into like a convex or concave mirror, or if you were looking into like a crystal ball, things like that. You get those distorted realities that they look real, but they don't look real, you know? That's at play, whereas if we kind of play this out in a real rigid sense, right? We get it like this. If we play it out in a more organic sense, it's a fisheye lens. It's exactly what it turns into. That is effectively an augmented 4-point perspective drawing, is a fisheye lens. There's a Salvador Dali drawing, self-portrait, that's a really beautiful example of that. These are my reminders that I'm going to put those on canvas for you. Right. So, that all makes sense in theory? Okay, so what I'd like to do now is let's go out and it might be a little chilly, it might not, we'll stand in the sun, but I want to stand outside for about 5 minutes actually seeing how this actually gets constructed in reality, okay?